If you've clicked on this video because you've just binged, I see you, because I have been there hundreds of times. I felt like I spent a lot of my life trying to recover from binging, trying to figure out how to stop binging, how to reset. So this video is about how to reset, but the trap that I was in, and I think many people might be as well, is that they keep trying to reset their behavior. And I realized that what I needed to do was I needed to reset my emotional and mental state, because our behavior is going to be informed by what's going on in our thoughts and feelings anyway. But when I shifted that focus rather off of what should I be eating tomorrow and more onto, okay, how do I shift how I'm thinking and feeling in this moment, that was a big part of what made the binges fewer and further apart. So I see the process of recovering from a binge as actually about rebalancing your brain. Because one of the main components of a binge is the sense that you have lost control. Now, we exercise control over our behavior up here in our executive functioning part of our brain. And then we have our lower brain, where we've got our emotions and our reactivity, and we've got our primal brain down there as well, which is all about our basic survival needs. And when we binge, it's like there's a dysregulation going on in our brain. The lower brain has become so reactive for whatever reason that it's taken over your conscious control. Now, that might be because of restriction and not eating enough. That might be because of other emotional things. It can even be habit and autopilot. But when we ignore what's going on in these different parts of our brains and we just say to ourselves, I'm going to behave like this from now on. For many people, it doesn't tend to work. If it works for you, great, do that. I'm just speaking to those of you for whom it doesn't, for whom you've made so many promises to yourself about how you're going to do it differently with food and felt like you can't stick to it and then blamed yourself for it. So there are two modes that I used to fall into after binging. And I'd be curious to know which mode you identify with the most. So the first mode is the mode of despair, helplessness, hopelessness, shame. Nothing's ever going to change. I'm the worst person in the world. I feel disgusted. I'm completely powerless. Versus the fix it mode, where it's like, right, enough is enough. I am not doing this ever again. I am going to watch a load of YouTube videos about giving up sugar, about fasting. I'm going to try and find some inspiration because I need to make some massive overhaul because this is absolutely unacceptable. So I'm going to do it differently from now on, and I'm feeling very motivated to do that. Now, both of these two modes make the likelihood of triggering a binge again very high. When you're in despair, certainly when I was in despair, I would do what my podcast co-host Stephanie Michelle calls meta-binging. And it's this idea that you keep binging because you're binging. So it's almost like you are binging to cope with the feelings of binging. Because for me, I was able to check out so much when I binged, it was like, once I stop binging and have to confront the fact that I'm binging, the shame, the overwhelm, the despair would be too much. So I just kept going. So a binge wouldn't necessarily just be a binge. A binge could be days, weeks, and even months of binging. Compared to being in fix-it mode, I would genuinely think that because in that moment I felt so determined that I would be able to hold on to that feeling of determination. And my binging was never more intense than when I was pursuing an abstinence approach of cutting foods out. It didn't matter whether I was eating enough physically. I don't know if it was my emotional brain, I don't know what it was, but there was some kind of rebellion going on. And we're often blamed for having this rebellion in our minds. Like, we should just be able to exercise top-down control over a part of our brain that is rebelling. And I couldn't do it. I was so frustrated because it just seemed like self-sabotage. I emphasize this point because if this is you, like, you're not alone. Many of us just have brains that work like this. So firstly, in order to rebalance our brains, there are two things to not do, and then I'm going to talk about a few things to do. Now, the two things not to do are linked to what I'm just saying. So the first thing is about over-controlling and cutting foods out. Now, if you are someone who can put in boundaries and rules around food and stick to them and not have that rebellious response, fine, great, do it. But stop assuming that the rest of us can and having a go at us when we can't. And then the second don't, which I don't really like the don't part of it because it sounds a little bit dismissive almost, but it's the catastrophization that is so prevalent in the despair. We need to be able to calm that catastrophization down, because when you are in despair, you are so zoomed out that you are focused on not just the fact you've binged now, But that feeling of despair comes from all the binges you've had in the past and all the binges you imagine that you're going to have in the future. That's why it feels catastrophic. So to calm our catastrophic thinking down, we need to zoom into the present. It's like, okay, I just binged and I might have uncomfortable feelings about that. I might feel disappointed. I might feel guilty, but really, what is my crime? My crime is I ate a lot of food in an out of control way. The catastrophization comes from all the times in the past and all the times you imagine in the future. To calm that down, we bring it into the now. Because in the now, what you're dealing with is the aftermath of one binge. And one binge doesn't have to mean something big until we make it mean something big. So on to the 3 do's. One of the things that balances the brain better than so many things, like this is underestimated, it's talked about a lot, but it almost becomes background noise. And it is the part of compassion. Compassion calms down emotional reactivity. Once you judge yourself for how you are feeling, you make the feeling a lot worse. You also add in shame. So all these feelings is stressing the limbic brain. And the more active the limbic brain, the harder it is to think clearly. Now I know it's easier said than done to just have compassion, but I think the first place to start is to realize that binge eating is not your fault. That's right, I said it, binge eating is not your fault. And I have a whole video explaining why, and I think it's the video that I would want everybody with binge eating to watch. The fear is, I guess, if you think it's not your fault, then that means you don't have any influence or you can't change anything, and that's not true either. I will link to that video above and below. Now, compassion is not letting yourself off the hook. Compassion is not telling yourself, oh, everything's fine, you're okay, everything's okay, because it doesn't feel okay. So it's okay to acknowledge that, to acknowledge what it is that you are feeling. Because sometimes people will go, okay, I just binged, let me just not think about it, let me just move on and I'll try not to do it. And that's not a terrible way to respond, but it does miss a piece. Because if you just bounce on from the binge without looking back at the binge and what happened, you miss an opportunity to understand. Which brings me to the second point, which is about curiosity. We need to understand our binge triggers if we are to stand any chance of breaking this cycle. The compassion will make you feel safe enough to go and look at the binge. What was the lead up to it? Why do you think it happened? Sometimes I'll invite people to go, okay, what would you like to have done differently? And what would need to be the case? Sometimes I'll invite people to look at, okay, what would you want to have done differently? At what point? And what would you have needed to have been able to do that? So it could be, quite often somebody will just say, well, I would just want to not binge, not start eating the thing at this point. But what would you need to be thinking and telling yourself or have put in place in order for a different outcome to happen? Because our behavior is following what we're thinking and feeling. So in that moment leading up to a binge, when your thinking and feeling is in that binge mode, the outcome is always going to be a binge. So for some people, it might be looking back and going, okay, I realized I had no plan for dinner. I didn't have anything in. I got over hungry and then I felt stressed about what to eat. And then I just ended up binging. Or there might be an emotional component. You noticed that something was going on throughout the day, but maybe you weren't paying attention to it. So it ended up morphing just into this craving to eat, to avoid whatever the emotional thing was that was going on. So it might be then, okay, well, I need to be paying attention a bit more to what I'm feeling. We cannot fix this problem of binging with the same thinking that created it. So this curiosity piece is about trying to understand this in a way that maybe up to this point you haven't. And in order to see it differently, we have to reduce the shame, which is why the compassion needs to come first. Now, here was one of the biggest shifts for me. After I binged, I started asking myself, instead of saying, oh, what am I going to do? How do I fix it? How do I make up for the fact that I binged? I started saying to myself, okay, how do I stay connected to myself? Or how do I reconnect to myself? Because when we binge, we have to disconnect. Whether we're disconnecting our brain from higher and lower, whether we're disconnecting from our body so we don't even feel the fullness. I think connection just as a concept is such an important piece of what makes us feel safe in the world. And when I talk about connection, I'm talking about 3 prongs of connection. Connection to ourselves, connection to others, and connection to the world. Now, for some people who perhaps have experienced a lot of trauma in relationships, the connection to others might be the least safe of those three connections. Or for some people, if there's a huge amount of shame in here, the connection to self might feel the least safe in all of those. But finding one or a few of these to plug into, it satisfies a hunger that we have in the higher, mid and lower brains for connection, because it's such a part of safety and our experience of ourselves. So connection to self could look like all the usual things like journaling, meditation, yoga, movement, even just being with your thoughts, any kind of self-care activities. That's all included in connection to self. Connection to others is about making arrangements to see people, to connect with people, to talk, to send a text. Only use this one with people in your life who feel like safe people. If you try to connect to someone in your life that you have a very difficult relationship with, they might be part of what keeps triggering the binges. And then connection to the world, because when I would binge, I would hide away from the world. And my world would just feel very small. It would just feel like wherever it was I was living at the time, this was my world. And that getting outside, getting out in green spaces, even just for me, getting out and working in a coffee shop for a couple of hours, just being around people, even if I'm not talking to them, that for me is a way that I feel really connected to the world and plugged in. Many people find nature does this for them. We've got 5 C's here in what I've shared with you, because we've got don't control and don't catastrophize. And then we've got the compassion, curiosity and connection piece. These feel like big themes, and you can go, well, none of those really feel like it's got a lot to do with food. I'm not saying that we can get through this process without thinking of food, but many people are hyper focused on food. And if you could shift your focus to calming down that shame, being your own ally, connecting, grounding, plugging back in so that your brain can rebalance itself. When your brain is calm, we can listen to all the different parts of ourselves. When our brain is stressed, it's like different parts of our brains take over. And the part of our brain that maybe we don't want to be in the driver's seat is the one that gets in the driver's seat and starts driving the car. And then we wake up in a wreckage. I've spoken about a lot of these themes throughout other videos I've done, so I will link to a few of my other videos below if this stuff makes sense to you and you want to go into it a bit deeper. The last thing I want to say is if you are in this cycle of binging, you are not broken, you're not weak-willed, you're not undisciplined, you're not all those things that you tell yourself. You're just stuck in a trap. You're watching content like this to try to find your way out of it. And I just hope that my content can help make that a little bit clearer for you. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.